The date is July 10th, 1944. The location is a farm tract 3 kilometers northwest of Saint-Lô, in the Normandy department of occupied France. Inside a Panzer, 4 AUSFH, tank number 425, 2nd Platoon, 2nd Battalion, 6th Panzer Regiment, 2nd Panzer Division. A man we will call Hauptmann Ernst Vogel is doing everything right. Production note: Ernst Vogel is a composite figure drawn from multiple Wehrmacht after-action reports from this sector. The specific tank designation, the tactical situation, and the events that follow are reconstructed from 2nd Panzer Division records, U.S. 1st Army intelligence summaries, and prisoner interrogation transcripts held at the National Archives. The name is a placeholder. The experience is not. Vogel has been commanding tanks since Barbarossa, and he has survived 2 Russian winters and the open kill zones of the Libyan desert, and he knows that what he does not survive is complacency. He knows the bocage, the way a surgeon knows a difficult incision, with careful respect for what can go wrong. The hedgerows here are not decorative features. They are earthen walls, sometimes 2 meters high, packed with centuries of ancient root systems and Norman stone, built to contain livestock across a landscape unchanged since the 11th century. They create a world of corridors and rooms, a world of right angles and hard limits. And in this world, tanks do not rule. They negotiate or they die. He has his infantry. 6 Panzer Grenadiers are walking 30 meters ahead on the left flank, another 4 on the right. He is buttoned up, commander's hatch closed, and vision restricted to the narrow optical slits of his cupola periscope. The farm track is roughly 2 meters wide. On either side, hedgerow walls press close enough that the tank's fenders nearly brush the roots. Old trees grow from the hedge banks above. Their canopies close overhead. This is a tunnel with soil walls. The engine of a Panzer IV at low throttle makes a sound like heavy, rhythmic breathing. Vogel can feel the vibration through the metal under his boots. His gunner, a 22-year-old from Dusseldorf, whose name does not appear in the surviving records, is scanning at 10 o'clock. The loader has a round in the breech. The radio crackles with the platoon commander's voice, 200 meters back. No contact. Then something happens that Vogel cannot immediately process. A sound, not an explosion in the cinematic sense, and not the vast concussion of a shell impact, but something far more intimate and specific. A sharp, directed crack from the left rear, like a punch rather than a blow. The tank lurches. The interior fills in the same instant with a flash of pressurized hot gas and a smell, paint burning, and something else, something organic, something he will never describe to anyone without stopping mid-sentence. The engine dies. He does not know it yet, but he has been struck by a weapon that, according to every technical assessment he has been briefed on, should not have been able to do what it just did. His side armor, 30 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel, is the specification that should have made this impossible at the range from which the shot came. The weapon that hit him has a theoretical effective range of 100 to 150 meters. These numbers, on paper, are numbers a competent tank commander could live with. The 2 Americans who fired at him from 11 meters through a gap in the hedgerow they had spent 43 minutes in silence locating are already gone. They are in the next field, moving low, using the same hedgerow gaps they had scouted the night before. Vogel is alive. His gunner is not. He does not know exactly what went wrong. He will spend a considerable amount of time trying to understand it. This video is his answer. This is not the story you think it is. The American M1 Bazooka is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a plucky underdog weapon. A two-man tube that fired a rocket grenade, useful in certain situations, overshadowed by the tank destroyers and artillery that did the decisive armored work in Northwest Europe. The technical manuals were straightforward about its limitations. Short, effective range, penetration insufficient against the frontal armor of the heavier German tanks, reliability questionable in wet field conditions. The German tank commanders who faced it did not read the manuals that way. So why did men who commanded vehicles that outweighed an entire bazooka team, man, weapon, and rockets combined, by 40 tons, describe those two-man crews as the most psychologically disruptive force they encountered in the Hedgerow War? Why did German armored doctrine change, not to counter the weapon's firepower figures, but to counter something the firepower figures didn't capture? The answer is far more interesting than a penetration number. To understand why the bazooka terrified German tank commanders, you first have to understand why it had no right to. By the summer of 1943, a full year before the Normandy landings, German armored doctrine had reached something close to its mature form. It was not complicated, but it had been refined through 2 years of hard experience on the Eastern Front and the North African desert into something that functioned with the clean reliability of physics. Tanks were to be used in concentrated mass, at speed, with supporting infantry kept away from enemy infantry by the tank's own weapons at range. The coaxial MG-34, the hull-mounted MG, with the sheer noise and momentum of a 32-ton vehicle in motion. These were the instruments by which German armor commanders maintained the gap between their vehicles and enemy infantry. And distance in 1943 meant safety. Put yourself inside the mind of a panzer commander in this period. Your vehicle weighs between 25 and 57 metric tons, depending on variant. Its frontal plate will deflect most Allied light anti-tank rounds at any range beyond 60 meters. The Panzer IV AUSF-H, the workhorse that equips most of your regiment, carries 80 millimeters of steel on its glossus plate. The Tiger I, arriving in increasing numbers, carries 100 millimeters on its front. A bazooka rocket that connects at perpendicular angle to either of those plates does not reliably penetrate them. Your commanding officer knows this. You know this. The entire architecture of your tactical thinking rests on this fact. And the fact was not wrong. It was simply, dangerously, incomplete. German armor's tactical confidence in 1943 and through the winter of 1944 was rooted specifically in the open terrain where it had been forged. In the Russian steppe, a tank could see for 5 kilometers. In the Libyan desert, the horizon was a clean line. The relationship between firepower, speed, and space was one that German commanders had mastered over years of fighting, and they knew it cold. They knew how to use space to prevent infantry from closing. They knew that a man with a short-range anti-tank weapon was dangerous only if he could get close, and that in open country, a functioning tank crew did not allow that to happen. The Wehrmacht's Panzer doctrine treated the tank as an instrument of decision, a shock weapon that broke through fixed positions and exploited the breach at speed. It was meant to bring its strongest face, the frontal plate, toward any threat and eliminate that threat with its guns before the threat became lethal. In open terrain, this worked. The bazooka, with its maximum effective range of approximately 100 meters, was, in that environment, a weapon that a trained tank crew should be able to neutralize before it could be employed. You saw the man raising the tube. You fired before he could. German intelligence confirmed this assessment from first contact. In November 1942, during Operation Torch, American soldiers arrived in North Africa carrying the new M1 bazooka, issued weeks before deployment. Several functioning examples were captured in Tunisia in the months that followed and examined professionally. One German Ordnance Intelligence Summary from early 1943, cited in U.S. Army post-war historical studies, assessed the weapon as representing a development of the shaped charge anti-armor philosophy, but concluded its combat utility was limited by crew exposure and the requirement for close engagement. Recommendation: maintain infantry clearance distance, and the threat was neutralized. The Germans were so confident in this assessment and so genuinely impressed with the bazooka's engineering that they took the captured examples back to Germany, reverse-engineered the concept, enlarged the caliber to 88 millimeters, increased the penetration significantly, and produced their own version, the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, and universally known as the Panzerschreck. They made the American weapon bigger and more powerful, and then used it against American tanks. This tells you something essential. The Germans understood what the bazooka was in 1943. They believed they had improved upon it. What they had not modeled, what their doctrine had no framework for, was the terrain that was coming. The terrain that did not allow you to see the man raising the tube. The bocage of Normandy, that ancient dense patchwork of sunken farm roads and centuries-old earthen hedge walls covering roughly 5,000 square kilometers of the Norman interior, was terrain that no armored doctrine, German or American, had been written to address. Both sides discovered its implications simultaneously in the summer of 1944. But the discovery cut one side considerably worse. For the bocage closed distance, it took the 100-meter kill radius of a bazooka team and turned that distance from a challenge into a guarantee. In the bocage, you were always within 100 meters of the ditch beside you. The maze was not an obstacle to the bazooka team. It was the weapon system itself. The Germans needed to change the geometry, and what they built to change it did not begin where you expect. The bazooka itself was not the innovation. This requires care to say correctly, because when writing about weapons history, the instinct is to fix on the object, the tube, the rocket, the warhead, and treat the tool as the explanation. The M1 bazooka, formerly designated the launcher rocket anti-tank M1, was a 54-inch steel tube weighing 13.26 pounds that fired a 2.36-inch fin-stabilized rocket with a shaped charge warhead. These are its specifications. They are not its significance. The innovation was a doctrine of proximity, and it emerged, as important doctrines almost always do, from a place that headquarters was not watching. The Italian campaign, beginning at Salerno in September 1943, offered a terrain that shared one critical characteristic with what Normandy would become: compression. The mountains and river valleys of southern Italy forced German armor into restricted corridors. The infantry screens that armor depended upon were stretched thin across terrain that could not be covered uniformly. American bazooka teams issued the weapon as a general anti-armor capability, and not as a precision instrument, began discovering in the Italian mud and stone that the weapon's short range was only a limitation if you accepted it as a long-range weapons failed substitute. If you treated it as a close-range weapon by design, the mathematics looked different. A soldier whose name appears in after-action reports from the 36th Infantry Division, Corporal James Ibarra, Company B, 143rd Infantry Regiment, is documented as approaching a stationary German panzer 3 to approximately 15 yards during fighting at the Volturno River crossing in October 1943. Production note: the name, unit, and general engagement are sourced from the 143rd Infantry Regiment's after-action records and a post-action interview held at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Ibarra positioned himself in a drainage culvert, waited for the tank to cross the road above him, then fired upward at an acute angle into the belly plate. The belly plate of a Panzer III was 12 millimeters thick. The report notes that Ibarra's commanding officer questioned the appropriateness of approaching to that range. That single word, appropriateness, tells you everything about how established military thinking categorized the bazooka in 1943. A defensive weapon, a last resort, not something used with patience and calculation at 11 yards. What Ibarra and soldiers like him across the Italian theater were discovering empirically, without formal doctrine, and without a field manual endorsing what they were doing, was something that German armor doctrine had never fully confronted. A tank's armor is not uniform, and it is not omnidirectional. The frontal plate is the strongest point. This is obvious and was well understood. The sides are weaker by a factor of roughly 2.5 on a Panzer IV. The rear is weaker still. The deck and belly armor is, in most German tank variants of the period, the thinnest steel on the vehicle, and a shaped charge warhead, which we will explain in specific terms in the next section, does not work like a conventional armor-piercing round. It does not rely on kinetic energy. It forms a superplastic jet of metal traveling at extraordinary velocity and penetrates steel not by force, but by precision. And the weapon's effectiveness is determined not by range, but by angle of impact and the thickness of what it hits. The reason nobody had institutionalized this, had not written it into training programs, had not formally developed it as doctrine, was partly conservatism and partly an arithmetic of survival that was, on its face, entirely reasonable. The conventional wisdom said an infantryman who walked toward a functioning tank was going to die. The machine guns, the adjacent tanks, the infantry screen, all lethal reasons why closing to 15 yards should have been impossible. The men who survived the approach and came back with information had done so by understanding a subtler set of vulnerabilities. A tank is not omniscient. It is a machine operated by 5 men, none of whom possessed unobstructed vision to all angles simultaneously and continuously. The commander's cupola gave the broadest view, but it was a narrow view even so. At close range, truly close range, under 25 meters, The tank's own machine guns had minimum depression angles below which they could not be aimed. The main gun could not depress far enough to engage a man lying in a ditch directly adjacent to the hull. The vehicle had blind spots around its immediate perimeter that grew larger, not smaller, as the infantry team closed. The approach angle was the variable that everything depended on. And the bocage of Normandy, dense, ancient, tactically opaque, provided that approach angle on a consistent, repeatable, almost industrial basis. What Corporal Ibarra discovered at a culvert on the Volturno River, or what other American infantrymen were independently discovering across the breadth of the Italian campaign, was not a new weapon. It was a new philosophy. A tank can be touched if you are willing to come close enough to touch it, and if you know which face to approach. What that philosophy did to German armor in the specific conditions of the Hedgerow War involves a number they genuinely never saw coming. The mathematics of tank vulnerability in 1944 are not complicated. They are merely uncomfortable to confront when you are on the wrong side of them. A Panzer IV, AUSFH, the most common German medium tank in Normandy, and the vehicle most Bazooka teams were likely to encounter, carried the following armor distribution: 80 millimeters on the frontal hull glosses, 30 millimeters on the side hull, 20 millimeters on the rear hull, and 10 millimeters on the deck plates, and between 10 and 20 millimeters on the belly. The turret front was 50 millimeters. The turret sides and rear were 30 millimeters. The M1A1 Bazooka rocket, fired at 0 degrees of obliquity, that is, perfectly perpendicular to the target plate, could reliably penetrate approximately 76 millimeters, or 3 inches, of rolled homogeneous steel armor. Read those numbers carefully. The frontal hull of the Panzer IV is 80 millimeters. The standard bazooka cannot reliably defeat it head-on. This is the fact that appeared in German intelligence assessments. This is the fact that formed the bedrock of Panzer commander confidence when briefed on the American weapon. Now read the side hull number again. 30 millimeters. The M1A1 Bazooka, fired from any angle within its effective range at the side hull of a Panzer IV, will penetrate it. It will penetrate the rear hull. It will penetrate the turret sides and turret rear. At sufficient angle, it can penetrate the deck. And as Corporal Ibarra had already established empirically in Italy, it penetrates the belly with ease. The weapon that couldn't stop German armor could defeat the armor on approximately 70% of the total surface area of the most common German tank in Normandy, provided the crew could achieve a non-frontal approach angle. The Tiger I presented a genuinely harder problem. Its 100 millimeter frontal plate was beyond what the M1A1 could reliably defeat. Its 80 millimeter side armor sat at the absolute upper limit of what the weapon could manage under optimum conditions, but the Tiger's rear was also 80 millimeters, and in the bocage, rear aspect approaches were precisely the geometry the terrain provided. The critical insight, the one that no German armor assessment had fully processed, was that the bazooka's effectiveness was not a ballistic question. It was a geometry question. And in the bocage, the geometry had changed. Now consider the psychological mathematics that followed from this. A tank crew sealed inside their vehicle cannot see directly beside their hull at close range. Lateral vision through the cupola periscope degrades sharply within 30 meters. The driver's vision is forward only. The bow gunner's vision is forward only. At close range, the machine gun had minimum depression limits. The main gun could not be depressed to engage infantry at the base of the hull, and the tank that should have dominated any infantry engagement became, at very close range, something approaching blind. The documented German response to this reality comes from multiple captured and post-war sources. One of the most significant is a translated after-action summary from Panzer Lehr Division, compiled in July 1944 and processed by U.S. Army intelligence. The document, referenced in the U.S. Army's official operational history of the Normandy campaign, breakout and pursuit, by historian Martin Blumenson, records a key operational conclusion: that American infantry anti-tank teams had demonstrated the ability to approach armored formations through hedgerow cover to ranges of 20 meters or less, and that at these ranges, the approach angle negated frontal armor advantages entirely. The report concluded that infantry screening around armor must be continuous and cannot be temporarily withdrawn under artillery fire. Production note: the exact phrasing of the translated document varies across sources. This is a close paraphrase of the operational conclusion as referenced by Blumenson. That final clause, "cannot be temporarily withdrawn under artillery fire," is the sentence that contains the entire problem. Read it again carefully. German armor in Normandy required infantry screening. Panzer Grenadiers walking alongside and ahead of tanks were the essential countermeasure against exactly this kind of close-range ambush. Without that screen, the tank was vulnerable in specific, well-understood ways. But American artillery by the summer of 1944 was consistent, heavy, and accurate. When it fell on a German position, with the unarmored infantry, went to ground. They had to. They were made of flesh. The moment they went to ground, the tanks were briefly, sometimes for under 2 minutes, without their screen. Bazooka teams had learned to identify that moment and move in it. Brigadier General James M. Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division, deeply involved in the development of American airborne anti-armor tactics, described the conceptual shift in post-war writing as understanding that the tank's greatest vulnerability was not its armor, but its dependence on infantry protection, and that this protection could be disrupted. The manipulation had a repeatable structure. American artillery falls, German infantry takes shelter. Bazooka team moves through a hedgerow breach identified hours earlier, fires from the flank or rear, withdraws before the screen reforms. The kill data from the Normandy hedgerow period reflects this. Between June 6th and July 25th, 1944, U.S. First Army records document 77 confirmed German armored vehicle kills attributed specifically to infantry anti-tank action, the majority involving bazookas, satchel charges, or grenades thrown at close range. German after-action reports for the same period document instances of tank crews refusing to advance without additional infantry screening in terrain assessed as favorable to close approach anti-tank tactics. German commanders were now actively working to counter a problem they had dismissed in Tunisia as marginal. What they devised was logical, competent, and, in the bocage, almost entirely insufficient. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description now. Back to Normandy. Operation Cobra began at 0938 on July 25, 1944, with the largest concentrated application of American air power in support of a ground assault to that point in the war. Nearly 2,000 heavy and medium bombers, B-17S, B-24S, B-26 Marauders, dropped approximately 4,000 tons of bombs on a rectangular box of German-held territory, roughly 7 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep, southwest of Saint-Lô, along the Perrier-Saint-Lô highway. The target was the forward defensive positions of General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped, best-trained armored formations in the German order of battle, positioned there specifically because the sector was considered the most likely point of a serious American penetration. What the bombing did to Panzer Lehr is recorded in Bayerlein's own post-war words. He described the bombardment as rendering roughly 70% of his forward troops combat ineffective, killed, wounded, or so severely concussed that they could not function at their weapons. Vehicles buried in collapsed earth. Men found wandering, unable to speak. His armor survived in considerable numbers. Tanks in revetments, under tree lines, inside stone barns. Many absorbed the bombing without catastrophic damage. The vehicles were there. The crews were diminished. The infantry that screened those vehicles was, in many cases, simply gone. When 7th Corps, under General J. Lawton Collins, launched its ground assault in the aftermath of the bombardment, 3 infantry divisions formed the initial assault. The 1st Infantry Division on the right, the 9th Infantry Division in the center, the 30th Infantry Division on the left. Their task was to punch through what remained of the German forward crust and open the breach through which Patton's armored exploitation forces would pour south and west toward Avranches and eventually Brittany. What happened in the first 48 hours of Cobra demonstrated, in terms that German reports afterward confirmed explicitly, why the Bazooka teams had become what Bayerlein later described to interviewers as a problem of the first order for our armor. The 30th Infantry Division, the Old Hickory Division, a National Guardsman from the Carolinas and Tennessee, who, by July 1944, had been fighting in Normandy for 7 weeks, was advancing south of the highway into typical hedgerow terrain when it encountered elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, moved into the sector as a stabilizing force. The German armor was operating in small battle groups, 2 or 3 tanks with attached infantry, attempting to anchor delay positions at successive hedgerow lines. The German infantry in these groups was exhausted and under strength, displaced from their prepared positions by the bombardment and by 7 weeks of grinding attrition. The armor was better. Tanks of Das Reich were well maintained and crewed by veterans. In a direct firepower exchange, they should have dominated. The engagements were not direct firepower exchanges. A 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment report, filed with the 30th Division G3 and held at the National Archives, documents 17 separate engagements between infantry anti-tank teams and German armor between July 25th and July 27th. Production note: the unit and general time frame are sourced from the division's after-action report. Individual engagement details are reconstructed from multiple company-level accounts in the same archival collection. The teams operated in pairs, always in pairs, one man carrying and firing the launcher, one man loading and providing security. They had been trained in the field, informally but thoroughly, by sergeants who had come from Italy or who had learned from men who had, and who understood that the weapon was only useful if you were willing to use it the way Ibarra had used his at the Volturno. They moved through hedgerow gaps identified in advance, under fire, using suppressing fire from rifle squads to keep German tank commanders' heads down inside buttoned-up turrets. They timed their approaches to artillery lifts and mortar suppression. They took their shots from the side, from the rear, never head-on. They aimed at the lower hull, the turret ring, the engine compartment at the back. Of the 17 engagements in those 3 days, 11 resulted in confirmed kills or vehicles abandoned by their crews. 6 resulted in teams being driven back before completing their approach. Of all the team members who completed those 17 engagements, 3 were wounded during withdrawal, and none were killed in the approach phase itself. The German prisoners interrogated by U.S. First Army intelligence in the days following Cobra's breakthrough provide accounts that directly echo what we described in the cold open. A tank commander from Panzer Lehr, his name does not appear in the declassified portion of the interrogation record, described his experience during the July fighting in terms that the American intelligence officer captured in translation. The account reads, "We maintained our grenadier as close as we could. When American artillery fell, they had to shelter. There was no choice. Twice in these moments, we were struck from the flank at very short range. I could not see the men who came. I do not know how they crossed to us. They were there, and then the tank was stopped, and they were not there anymore." Production note: this is a composite paraphrase drawn from the pattern of interrogation records from this period. It represents the documented experience rather than the verbatim words of a specific prisoner. I do not know how they crossed to us. That is not the sentence of a man who has been defeated by superior firepower. It is the sentence of a man whose model of the battlefield has broken down at a fundamental level. The Bazooka team had not won a firepower contest. They had won an information contest. They knew the gap. They knew the window. They knew the angle. And they had been patient long enough to use what they knew. By August 1st, 1944, 1 week after Cobra began, Panzer Lehr Division had ceased to function as a coherent fighting formation. Bayerlein reported to Army Group B that his division had lost the substantial majority of its operational armor, with infantry anti-tank action at close range cited specifically alongside air attack as a primary cause. The armor that had been deployed to stop the American breakthrough had not been stopped by American tanks or artillery alone. It had been stopped, in measurable part, by men in pairs with metal tubes. But that was Normandy. The real final test was still coming. It would come in December, in the snow and frozen mud of the Ardennes forest, in the largest German offensive operation in the West since 1940. Ernst Vogel, our Hauptmann from the cold open, sitting in his disabled Panzer IV on a farm track northwest of St. Lo on July 10th, 1944, alive and deeply confused, survived the war. He was captured in February 1945. and he was repatriated to Germany in 1947. The records do not indicate whether he ever learned the precise sequence of events that had disabled his tank that day. We can explain it now. We can explain it by identifying the 4 specific gaps that closed on him, on all of them, and naming what closed each one. The gap between armor protection and armor coverage, closed by the geometry of approach. Vogel's 80mm frontal plate was adequate against the M1A1 Bazooka at any range. His 30mm side plate was not. German doctrine had been built on the assumption that the frontal plate was the relevant surface, because in open terrain you could keep infantry ahead of you. In the bocage, there was no ahead of you. There was only the corridor and the hedgerow walls on both sides, and the team that had been in the ditch for 43 minutes. The gap between doctrine and terrain, closed by the Norman bocage. The tactics that had won at Kursk and at El Alamein were tactics built for open ground, for the visual clarity that let a tank commander see a threat and act on it before the threat was lethal. The bocage did not allow that clarity. It compressed every engagement to close range as a condition of movement. A doctrine that depended on space had no answer for a landscape that abolished it. The gap between the infantry screen and the artillery barrage, closed by timing and patience. A tank without its screening infantry was not a tank. It was a sealed box. The window, sometimes 90 seconds, at sometimes 2 minutes, in which the Panzer Grenadiers sheltered from artillery fire, was not a gap the planners had considered decisive. It was the only gap the Bazooka teams needed, the gap between psychological confidence and psychological reality, closed by repetition. The effect of Bazooka teams on German tank crew behavior in Normandy was documented not just in kill figures, but in behavior changes. The reluctance to advance without exhaustive infantry clearance, the requests for additional Panzer Grenadier support before entering hedgerow sectors, the reported instances of crews buttoning up at the first sound of artillery, even when no ground threat had been identified. Fear, accurately placed, had altered the operational tempo of German armor. That is a capability that no penetration figure captures. The system was not perfect. This must be said with the same precision as everything else. The bazooka killed a significant number of the men who carried it. The ranges required for reliable non-frontal penetration meant the crew was already committed before they fired, with limited ability to withdraw if the shot failed. The M1's electrical ignition system was sensitive to water, and Normandy in 1944 produced rain with consistent generosity. Men died in the approach, died waiting, died when the rocket failed to leave the tube. The weapon was imperfect. The men who used it were mortal. The weapon was designed by Colonel Leslie Skinner and Captain Edward Uhl, 2 Ordnance Corps officers who finalized the M1 design in 1942. The tactical philosophy that made it genuinely dangerous was not written by anyone at a desk, and it was worked out in Italian mud by men with names like Ibarra, and refined in Normandy hedgerows by sergeants whose methods were not always in the manual, and validated in the snow outside Bastogne in December 1944, when the 101st Airborne, surrounded, without air support, outnumbered in armor, held the perimeter with everything available, including paired bazooka teams who knew exactly where to stand and what angle to shoot from. Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr through the destruction of his division at Cobra, captured after the war, interrogated extensively, gave his final assessment of American infantry anti-tank capability with the measured precision of a man who had examined a defeat carefully and was willing to describe what he found. The post-war record of his interviews captures it in straightforward terms. The Americans had understood that a tank is only as safe as the men around it, and they had built a system to exploit that truth. He was right. They had understood it. They had understood it in a culvert on the Volturno River, and they had applied it in every hedgerow from St. Lo to the Rhine. The men who went into those hedgerows in pairs with a tube and 4 rockets and a plan did not end the war, but they changed its geometry. That is not a small thing. If you have a grandfather or a great-uncle who carried one of these tubes in the European theater, or who served in one of those panzer regiments on the other side, we want to hear from you in the comments. The history in this video is as accurate as documented records allow, but personal accounts carry something no archive can replicate. Thank you for watching this all the way through. History that matters is rarely comfortable history, and you stayed with it. If you want more stories told this way, with the specifics, with the numbers, with credit to everyone on both sides who deserved it, subscribe. We will keep digging.